In a quiet, rain-soaked town, far from the bustling noise of the city, Marie Johnson had always been a comforting presence. A dedicated nurse, mother, and friend, she was the type of person who could turn even the hardest day around with her warmth and kindness. Her life, though not one of great wealth or renown, was filled with purpose and love. But as she walked home one evening, tired yet content, something unimaginable was waiting just around the corner. Marie's day had started like any other. She had spent the morning helping her patients, going above and beyond as she always did, checking in on those who had no family nearby. To her, this was more than a job, it was a calling. She had worked extra hours as usual, making sure no one left the clinic feeling unnoticed. Finally, as night fell, she made her way home, exhausted but fulfilled. But when she stepped through her front door that evening, her world shifted in an instant. Flashing red and blue lights cast shadows against her walls, and uniformed officers waited in her living room. Their faces were unreadable, their intentions unclear. Before she could process the scene, they had placed her in handcuffs, informing her of accusations that felt as foreign as a bad dream. Theft, embezzlement. They spoke as if they were describing someone she had never known. Marie looked around, dazed, struggling to understand how the world she had trusted had turned on her so suddenly. She was alone, her family's voices distant echoes in her mind as she sat in silence, the realization sinking in that her life was no longer her own. Detective Paul Carter was known throughout the precinct as a man with a mission, with a reputation for getting results and a track record of high-profile convictions. He was the kind of detective the media loved to follow. To his colleagues, he was driven, relentless, and a bit too certain of himself. To Paul, every case was a puzzle to be solved, and every criminal a personal challenge. When he received the call about Marie Johnson, he saw it as just another case to close. Paul had learned early in his career to trust evidence over everything else. Witness testimonies could be clouded by emotion, and people often lied, sometimes to protect others, sometimes to protect themselves. So, when the initial reports suggested Marie might have been involved in a series of financial discrepancies at the hospital, he didn't hesitate to dig deeper. The mounting evidence against her felt like the pieces of a puzzle locking perfectly into place. It didn't matter that Marie's record was spotless, or that she had been a beloved member of her community. All that mattered were the facts laid out before him, or so he thought. Across town, Marie's attorney, Chen, was just beginning to gather details about her client's case. Young but sharp, Sarah had developed a reputation for taking on cases that others overlooked or dismissed as hopeless. For her, this was more than just a job. It was a crusade against a system that, she believed, too often jumped to conclusions about people who couldn't defend themselves. Her firm belief in justice made her fierce in the courtroom, especially when she sensed that the odds were stacked against her clients. When she first met Marie, she sensed an unusual combination of strength and vulnerability. Despite her quiet demeanor, Marie's innocence shone through every word, every gesture, every tear she tried to hold back. Sarah could see this wasn't a woman accustomed to the harsh lights of interrogation rooms or the cold stares of prosecutors. And yet, despite everything, Marie was determined not to let this nightmare defeat her. But even as Sarah prepared her case, she knew she faced an uphill battle. Detective Carter had a reputation for leaving no stone unturned, and his confidence in the evidence was unshakable. In the legal world, once someone like him believed in a person's guilt, it became a mountain to prove otherwise. With the weight of public opinion leaning heavily on Carter's side, Sarah had to summon every ounce of her resolve to push back against a narrative that was spreading like wildfire. In the courtroom, the stage was set for a fierce battle between two figures, a detective who saw only the black and white of evidence and a lawyer who believed in the shades of gray that lay within every story. As they prepared for what would become the defining case of their careers, each was forced to confront not only their own beliefs, but also the true meaning of justice. Marie's arrest shook the small town to its core. News of the charges spread quickly, and it wasn't long before gossip and speculation replaced the warmth and respect that once surrounded her. To her friends and family, the allegations were incomprehensible, and yet the details of the case painted a picture that seemed all too damning. The case against her, built by Detective Carter and his team, was crafted with a precision that made her innocence seem like a distant, fading hope. The accusations centered around a series of financial discrepancies at the hospital where Marie worked. Over several months, funds had been diverted from the accounts designated for patient care, leaving a significant gap in the hospital's finances. At first, these discrepancies were minor, almost unnoticeable. But as time went on, the amounts grew larger, reaching a total that could no longer be ignored. An internal audit raised suspicions, and soon after, the hospital's administration alerted the authorities. The investigators quickly zeroed in on Marie. As the lead nurse in her department, she had access to financial records and an understanding of hospital procedures that few others possessed. A series of login records showed her accessing accounts at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, with transactions that were hard to explain. What once might have seemed like harmless overtime now appeared, through Carter's eyes, as a calculated plan to embezzle funds. To the prosecution, Marie's modest lifestyle, a necessity for her family, was suddenly cast in a new light, as if every penny saved was somehow part of a criminal enterprise. As Carter assembled his case, he grew more confident in his conclusions. Witnesses were questioned, and small inconsistencies in Marie's routine were highlighted as potential evidence of her deceit. Statements from co-workers who once admired her were twisted into implications of secrecy or unusual behavior. The prosecutor, eager for a swift conviction, emphasized these findings, painting a story of Marie as a trusted figure who had exploited her position for personal gain. Meanwhile, the town's perception of Marie shifted rapidly. People who once spoke of her with admiration now whispered about her supposed double life. Friends became distant, and even casual acquaintances eyed her with suspicion. The media latched onto the story, portraying her as a shocking example of betrayal within a trusted institution. The headlines grew more scandalous by the day, each one a reminder to Marie that her innocence was no longer assumed. Inside her jail cell, Marie grappled with feelings of despair and disbelief. How could her life, her family, her work, everything she'd built, be destroyed so quickly? Each day she replayed her last few months, trying to recall any detail that might prove her innocence. But the evidence against her felt overwhelming, almost insurmountable. As the days passed, the walls of her cell seemed to close in tighter, mirroring the community's growing certainty in her guilt. For Sarah Chen, Marie's attorney, the case presented a challenge unlike any she'd faced before. Every piece of evidence pointed directly to her client, and each witness statement seemed to add another nail to Marie's figurative coffin. But Sarah's gut told her something didn't add up. There was a clarity in Marie's eyes, a conviction in her voice that resonated deeply with Sarah. It was as if the truth lay hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to look closely enough to find it. As Sarah began to peel back the layers of the case, she uncovered troubling inconsistencies. Documents were missing, timelines didn't quite match up, and some of the evidence seemed almost too perfect, too convenient. The more she dug, the more she sensed that there was more to this case than met the eye. Yet, with each new discovery, she faced resistance, not just from the prosecution, but from a community that had already made up its mind. Carter, too, felt the weight of the case bearing down on him. While he was convinced of Marie's guilt, there were moments late at night when a flicker of doubt crept in. But he quickly brushed it aside, refusing to let anything shake his resolve. To him, Marie's innocence was a lost cause, a faint and fading possibility that he had neither time nor desire to consider. After all, the evidence was solid, the case was tight, and the truth, at least in his mind, was clear. The stage was set for a fierce battle in the courtroom, where two opposing views of Marie's character would collide. For Sarah, the challenge was not just to prove Marie's innocence, but to restore her humanity in the eyes of a town that had all but abandoned her. And for Carter, it was a race to close a case that to him was already solved. Alone in her cell, Marie clung to memories of her family like a lifeline, grounding her amidst the chaos of accusation and betrayal. She had always been a quiet yet constant presence in her loved ones' lives, a woman who didn't need attention or applause, but found meaning in the smallest acts of kindness. Her role as a mother defined her, and her children were her world. Now, they were kept at a distance, allowed only brief, stilted visits, where the sight of their confused, tearful faces left Marie's heart shattered and raw. Each night, as silence settled in around her, Marie revisited the fragments of her life that still brought her comfort. She remembered her daughter's bedtime stories, the hushed laughter they shared over silly jokes, and her son's proud smile the day he learned to ride his bike. It was in these memories that Marie found the courage to endure, even as everything she had ever believed about herself seemed to crumble under the weight of the accusations. To those who knew her, Marie was the embodiment of selflessness. Friends remembered her as the one who always volunteered to help, whether it was watching a neighbor's child or driving an elderly patient to a doctor's appointment on her day off. Her colleagues at the hospital spoke of her as someone whose compassion seemed boundless, a nurse who stayed late to comfort a grieving family or worked an extra shift to make sure her patients felt cared for. As the trial loomed, Sarah, her attorney, worked tirelessly to convey this side of Marie to the court. She knew that the person depicted in the prosecution's narrative, a calculated, heartless figure, couldn't be further from the truth. She wanted the jury to see what she saw every time she met with Marie, a woman terrified of losing her family, of being painted as someone she didn't recognize in her own reflection. During one of their meetings, Sarah asked Marie about her life before all of this, hoping to unearth any detail that could help their case. Marie hesitated, not because she didn't want to share, but because she felt those memories slipping away, dulled by the relentless march of days behind bars. Finally, she told Sarah about her favorite moments with her children, the long walks they used to take by the river, her daughter's habit of making her laugh during breakfast. As she spoke, a tear traced down her cheek, and for a moment the walls of the cell seemed to fade, replaced by the warmth of home. Sarah took these moments to heart, vowing to protect Marie's truth in a courtroom eager to view her as anything but innocent. She knew that humanizing Marie was crucial, not just to sway the jury, but to remind the town and even the prosecutor that this wasn't a story of villains and victims. It was a story of a woman's life, unjustly marred, and of a family left on the brink, struggling to stay whole. As Sarah delved deeper into the details of Marie's case, she discovered that what seemed straightforward at first was anything but. The evidence against Marie had been meticulously compiled, with every document and witness statement pointing clearly in her direction. Yet Sarah's instinct told her there was more beneath the surface. This wasn't just about paperwork or numbers. It was about the kind of person Marie was, and Sarah was determined to prove it. Her first step was to retrace the path of the investigation, starting with Detective Carter's files. She pored over the surveillance footage, financial records, and login histories, searching for any sign of a mistake, a misinterpretation, something that didn't fit. As she examined the login records that had been flagged as suspicious, she began to notice an odd pattern. Several of these accesses, which had been attributed to Marie, occurred at times when she had verifiable alibis, shifts documented on other floors, or hours she'd been recorded on hospital security cameras interacting with patients. It was a small detail, but one that could potentially unravel the case. Sarah wondered why no one else had questioned these timestamps, why they had simply accepted that the logins must have been Marie's. The deeper she looked, the clearer it became. Assumptions had been made at every turn, and each assumption had led directly to her client. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Sarah reached out to an independent forensic specialist to analyze the hospital's system logs. At the same time, Sarah began interviewing Marie's colleagues, hoping to find someone who could vouch for her character and integrity. She talked to nurses, doctors, even patients, listening to story after story about Marie's dedication. Some colleagues admitted to feeling pressured by the investigation, sensing that they were expected to find fault in her. A few spoke about the shift in the hospital's culture over recent months, noting how tensions had risen after new management implemented strict cost-cutting measures, sometimes at the expense of patient care. These interviews painted a different picture, one that Sarah hoped to use in court. But she also knew she needed hard evidence, something tangible to counter the prosecution's ironclad narrative. As her forensic specialist finished his review, he confirmed Sarah's suspicions. He had identified signs that someone might have tampered with Marie's login credentials, using her access to conduct transactions she knew nothing about. With a combination of technical skill and patience, he traced the suspicious logins back to a second set of credentials linked to another employee. Armed with this new information, Sarah began to reconstruct an alternate timeline. She pieced together a possible scenario in which Marie's login credentials had been compromised, possibly by someone with access to the hospital's internal systems. And though the culprit's identity remained unclear, the motive became more apparent with each passing day. Someone had used Marie as a scapegoat, hoping to hide their own actions behind her reputation. As the pieces of this puzzle fell into place, Sarah knew she had to proceed carefully. It wasn't just about proving Marie's innocence. She was now confronting a deeper web of deceit within the hospital itself. Sarah prepared her arguments, ready to present her findings in court, but she was under no illusion about the challenge ahead. The prosecution had spent weeks cementing Marie's guilt in the minds of the jury, and breaking through that narrative would be no easy feat. For the first time since the investigation had begun, Sarah felt a spark of hope. With this new evidence, she could challenge the assumptions that had condemned her client. But she also knew that if she failed, the weight of that failure would fall entirely on Marie's shoulders, leaving her to bear the burden of a system's mistakes. The courtroom was tense, every seat filled as Marie's trial entered its most critical phase. This was the moment Sarah had been preparing for, the time to present the findings that could dismantle the case against her client. Across the aisle, Detective Carter and the prosecution sat with calm confidence, certain that the evidence they'd built would withstand any challenge. They had crafted a narrative around Marie that had already sunk deeply into the minds of the jury, but Sarah was prepared to shake the foundations of that story. As she rose to deliver her opening statement for the defense, Sarah's gaze swept over the faces of the jury, each expression a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. She began by acknowledging the severity of the charges and the trust the hospital and community had placed in Marie, painting a picture of a woman who would never betray that trust. She reminded them that justice required a commitment to the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be to confront. Then she introduced the new evidence. Sarah's forensic specialist took the stand, carefully explaining the technical intricacies of the hospital's login system. He described how credentials could be misused, how access logs could be manipulated, and how someone with a moderate level of technical skill could easily exploit the system to make it look as though Marie had been conducting unauthorized transactions. The jury leaned forward, taking in every word, their initial expressions of doubt beginning to shift as the expert demonstrated how specific timestamps had been altered or forged. With each new piece of evidence, Sarah worked to paint an alternate picture of the crime. She highlighted the pattern of discrepancies that pointed to a different employee, suggesting that Marie's innocence had been overlooked in the rush to find a suspect. She presented documents showing Marie's exact movements during the times of several critical logins, proving that she could not have accessed the system as the prosecution claimed. Each fact Sarah laid before the court was like a small flame in the darkness, illuminating a path that led away from Marie's guilt. As Sarah continued her examination of witnesses, she called on Marie's colleagues to speak to her character. Nurses and doctors testified about the countless hours Marie had dedicated to her patients, often staying late or arriving early, never once giving the impression that she was anything but committed to her work. Her supervisors admitted that they had no direct evidence linking Marie to any wrongdoing outside of the logins and financial records, which, as Sarah had now shown, were questionable at best. Finally, Detective Carter was called to the stand. The courtroom shifted as he took his place, his confident expression unyielding. Sarah approached him carefully, knowing this was a delicate moment. She questioned him on his investigative process, asking why he hadn't considered alternative suspects or double-checked Marie's credentials. Carter's answers were precise but guarded, and Sarah sensed his frustration as she continued pressing. "Detective Carter," she said, her voice steady but firm, "is it possible that the case against Miss Johnson was built on assumptions rather than facts?" Carter hesitated, the first sign of uncertainty cracking through his stoic exterior. "We followed the evidence," he replied, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his tone. "All signs pointed to her. But did you ever consider the possibility that those signs were planted?" Sarah countered, her voice growing sharper. "Did you question the integrity of the login system? Did you investigate other employees who might have had access to Marie's credentials?" Carter's silence was telling, and the jury took note. As Sarah continued, she presented more examples of procedural shortcuts taken during the investigation, instances where assumptions had been treated as facts and the evidence had been skewed to fit a convenient story. Carter's confidence wavered visibly, and by the end of Sarah's questioning, the once unshakable case against Marie began to look fragile. The prosecution attempted to redirect, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the flaws in Carter's investigation, the gaps in the prosecution's narrative. Sarah's meticulous questioning had exposed the holes in their story, leaving room for the possibility that Marie might, in fact, be innocent. As Sarah returned to her seat, she glanced at Marie, who met her gaze with a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. For the first time since her arrest, Marie saw a light at the end of the tunnel, a chance that the truth might finally set her free. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. What once seemed like an open and shut case now teetered on the edge of uncertainty. Each revelation Sarah brought to light had chipped away at the prosecution's narrative, and now the weight of the truth began tipping the scales in Marie's favor. But Sarah knew that a few pieces of evidence and testimony weren't enough. She needed a breakthrough, a single moment that would make the jury see Marie as the victim of a flawed investigation, not a perpetrator. That moment arrived with the unexpected testimony of a witness who had, until then, remained silent. An anonymous hospital staff member, previously too frightened to come forward, finally agreed to testify in Marie's defense. This witness, a junior IT technician, had overheard conversations between two hospital administrators discussing financial discrepancies. They mentioned concerns over Marie's credentials being conveniently accessible, and joked about how easy it was to pin things on someone who wouldn't suspect a thing. As the technician took the stand, Sarah could feel the tension building. She carefully guided the witness through their account, coaxing out details that hinted at something deeper than just an innocent misunderstanding. The technician described strange occurrences in the hospital's financial database and how, on more than one occasion, they had noticed unusual access patterns involving Marie's credentials. But when they'd tried to report their suspicions, they'd been warned by a superior to keep quiet and stay out of things that didn't concern them. The courtroom fell silent as the technician recounted these warnings. The jurors listened intently, their expressions shifting as they absorbed the implications of what had just been revealed. It was no longer just a matter of whether Marie was innocent. It was now a question of whether someone within the hospital had actively framed her to hide their own misconduct. The prosecutor attempted to undermine the technician's credibility, suggesting that they were simply a disgruntled employee with a vendetta. But the technician's sincerity shone through, their voice steady and clear as they explained their reasons for coming forward. "I couldn't stand by and watch someone's life be destroyed for something they didn't do," they said, meeting each juror's gaze with a quiet strength. For Sarah, this was the moment she had been waiting for. The technician's testimony cast doubt not just on the evidence against Marie, but on the integrity of the entire investigation. It suggested a cover-up within the hospital, a deliberate effort to redirect blame onto someone who had no way to defend herself. Sarah seized on this shift in momentum, reinforcing to the jury that the case against Marie was not just flawed, it was built on a lie. The technician's words planted a seed of doubt in the jury, one that no amount of redirect from the prosecution could fully uproot. The narrative that had once seemed so clear-cut now felt muddied, complicated by motives and machinations that had little to do with justice. As the jury was dismissed for the day, Sarah caught a glimpse of their thoughtful, unsettled expressions, and she knew that a turning point had truly been reached. For Marie, it was the first glimmer of vindication. She felt a fragile sense of hope rising within her, like a spark in the darkness, reminding her that there were still people willing to stand up for the truth. And in that moment, she began to believe that freedom was no longer an impossible dream, but a real, attainable outcome. With the tide shifting in Marie's favor, Sarah knew it was time to introduce a bold, unorthodox approach to her defense. She needed something that would not only break down the prosecution's case, but also reshape the way everyone in the courtroom viewed Marie and the system that had failed her. After careful consideration, Sarah decided to employ a live demonstration of how Marie's login credentials could have been exploited. She understood that for the jury to truly grasp the extent of the manipulation, they needed to see it with their own eyes. On the day of the demonstration, Sarah called her forensic specialist back to the stand. This time he came prepared with a laptop and a secure connection to simulate the hospital's login system. The judge allowed the demonstration, recognizing its importance in helping the jury understand the technical complexity of the case. The forensic specialist began by explaining in simple terms how easily someone with minimal IT knowledge could access and alter records without leaving a trace. He then recreated a scenario in which Marie's credentials were used by another party to conduct unauthorized transactions. As the specialist typed in real time, showing how credentials could be borrowed and manipulated, the courtroom watched in astonishment. The simulated Marie Johnson profile popped up on the screen, seemingly conducting transactions that, in reality, were being orchestrated by someone else entirely. The demonstration was so seamless that it left little doubt about how Marie could have been framed. By the end, even the most skeptical members of the jury appeared visibly shaken. This approach had a profound effect. It highlighted not only Marie's innocence, but also the vulnerability of the system itself, a flaw that could potentially jeopardize the reputation and careers of those who had built their case on its supposed infallibility. Sarah seized the moment to reinforce her point, turning to the jury as she reminded them that this case wasn't just about Marie. It was about the countless others who could be subjected to the same errors, forced to prove their innocence against a system that rarely questioned its own assumptions. As the demonstration concluded, murmurs spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor, visibly thrown, scrambled to recover, trying to downplay the significance of the demonstration. But the damage was done. The narrative of Marie as a criminal mastermind had lost its credibility. The jury now saw her not as a perpetrator, but as someone caught in the crossfire of a broken system. For Sarah, this was more than a victory for her client. It was a wake-up call for everyone involved. She made a final appeal to the jury's sense of justice, reminding them that the system itself had flaws that needed addressing. This case, she argued, was an opportunity to prevent future injustices by acknowledging and addressing those flaws here and now. By the time she returned to her seat, Sarah could feel the shift in the room. Her innovative approach had not only dismantled the prosecution's case, but had also introduced a new perspective on justice, one that extended beyond her client. For Marie, it felt like a new beginning, a chance to reclaim her life and to transform her story from one of wrongful accusation to one of resilience and truth. As the trial neared its conclusion, Sarah's closing arguments reinforced this message of change. She asked the jury to consider not only the facts, but also the principles that guided their understanding of guilt and innocence. This was a trial not just of Marie's actions, but of the very system that had accused her. And in that moment, the possibility of change felt real, tangible, a beacon of hope for those still seeking justice. The courtroom was filled with a tense, almost expectant silence as Sarah prepared for her final cross-examination. Her last witness was someone unexpected, a former hospital administrator who had resigned just weeks before Marie's arrest. Rumors had circulated about his sudden departure, but until now, no one had been able to reach him for comment. Sarah's team had tracked him down, and he had reluctantly agreed to testify, compelled by a desire to clear his conscience. As the administrator took the stand, his discomfort was evident. He avoided eye contact with the prosecution, his gaze directed toward his hands. Sarah began gently, asking about his role in the hospital's financial oversight. The administrator's answers were careful, guarded, as if he was weighing each word. But as Sarah's questions progressed, the truth began to surface. He hesitated before finally revealing the information Sarah had been waiting for. The hospital's internal systems, he admitted, had known vulnerabilities, ones that higher-ups were aware of, but had chosen not to address due to budget constraints. These vulnerabilities had allowed employees to access each other's credentials, a flaw that had been quietly acknowledged but never publicly disclosed. It was a detail that could explain the strange logins tied to Marie's account, something the prosecution had dismissed as impossible. The prosecutor objected, attempting to paint the administrator's testimony as irrelevant, but the judge allowed it to continue. Sarah pressed on, asking why this information had never been documented or reported. The administrator's answer struck a chord. "We didn't want the liability. Fixing it would have cost money we didn't have, and we assumed it wouldn't be a problem until now." The impact of his words rippled through the courtroom. The prosecution's case, once seemingly airtight, now hung by a thread. For weeks, the jury had been led to believe that Marie's actions were clear-cut violations of trust, but this testimony cast everything into doubt. If anyone could have accessed Marie's credentials, then the entire foundation of the case was flawed. Marie was no longer simply defending herself. The entire premise of her guilt was crumbling under the weight of this revelation. Sarah took a moment to let the gravity of the statement settle over the room. She looked at each juror, allowing them to absorb what they had just heard. This was the breakthrough, the pivotal moment that redefined the entire case. The prosecution had built a narrative around trust and security, but now the very institution that had accused Marie was revealed to be careless and negligent. For Marie, this moment was liberating. She felt an invisible weight lift, the constant knot of fear and uncertainty loosening. As Sarah concluded her questioning, it was clear that the jury's perception had shifted. The truth had finally emerged, casting Marie in a different light, not as a criminal, but as an innocent woman trapped in a web of oversight and indifference. With the final pieces of evidence and testimony in place, Sarah began crafting her closing argument. She knew this was her chance to solidify Marie's innocence in the minds of the jury. Over the past few weeks, she had meticulously dismantled the prosecution's case, exposing the flaws and assumptions that had led to Marie's wrongful arrest. Now, she needed to connect the dots, to bring every revelation together into a powerful narrative that couldn't be ignored. When she addressed the jury, Sarah spoke with a conviction honed by months of relentless work. She reminded them of the initial perception of Marie, the assumptions about her character, and the allegations that had seemed so damning. But then, she asked the jurors to reconsider those assumptions in light of everything they had heard over the course of the trial: the compromised security at the hospital, the testimony from the administrator, the witnesses who had vouched for Marie's integrity. She painted a picture of a woman whose life had been upended not by her own actions, but by the failings of the very institution she had served loyally for years. Sarah spoke of the courage it had taken for Marie to fight this battle, to stand up against a system that had quickly labeled her as guilty. "Marie Johnson is not just fighting for herself," Sarah said, her voice steady, "but for the integrity of our justice system, a system that must protect the innocent as fiercely as it prosecutes the guilty. Today, you have the power to correct a wrong, to restore dignity to a woman who has lost so much." She moved on to address the prosecution's case directly, pointing out the lack of concrete evidence tying Marie to any wrongdoing. Each login, each transaction, each piece of evidence presented against her had crumbled when viewed under the light of truth. Sarah reminded the jury that while the prosecution had tried to cast Marie as a manipulative criminal, they had been unable to provide even a single piece of evidence that definitively proved her guilt. Everything had been built on assumptions, on circumstances twisted to fit a convenient narrative. By the time Sarah finished her argument, the courtroom was silent. The jury sat in deep contemplation, processing the weight of the decision before them. The prosecution attempted a rebuttal, but their words fell flat. The case they had so confidently presented now felt flimsy, riddled with holes that Sarah had expertly exposed. As the judge gave the final instructions to the jury, Sarah returned to her seat, her heart pounding. She looked over at Marie, who sat with her hands tightly clasped, her eyes a mixture of hope and exhaustion. This was it, the culmination of months of fear, resilience, and unwavering belief in her own innocence. The jury was dismissed to deliberate, and as they filed out, Sarah felt a sense of calm settle over her. She had done everything she could, leaving no stone unturned, no question unanswered. Now it was up to the jury to see the truth that had been laid out before them, to restore the justice that had been denied to Marie from the start. The jury deliberated for hours, each passing minute stretching the tension in the room. Marie sat beside Sarah, her hands clenched tightly, as they waited for the final word that would decide her fate. Finally, the door opened, and the jurors filed back into the courtroom. The foreperson stood, glancing briefly at Marie, before speaking the words that would change her life forever. Not guilty. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, followed by scattered applause. Tears filled Marie's eyes as she gripped Sarah's hand, her shoulders shaking with the weight of emotions she had held back for so long. After months of uncertainty, doubt, and fear, she was finally free. The nightmare was over, and she could return to her family, her children, and the life she had fought so hard to protect. The impact of Marie's case rippled far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Her story quickly became a symbol of resilience and hope, sparking conversations across the town about the justice system's responsibility to protect the innocent. For many, Marie's exoneration highlighted the dangers of a legal system that sometimes valued efficiency over truth, quick convictions over careful investigations. The hospital, facing a public outcry over its role in the accusations, launched an internal investigation that led to sweeping changes in its policies, including enhanced security measures to prevent future incidents of identity misuse. Sarah's work on Marie's case earned her recognition as well. Her persistence and dedication to uncovering the truth resonated with the community, and she became known as a defender of those wrongfully accused. Many sought her counsel, inspired by her determination to challenge a broken system. For Sarah, the case reaffirmed her commitment to justice, reminding her why she had chosen to become a lawyer in the first place. She knew there were others like Marie, people who needed someone to believe in them, and she vowed to continue fighting for those who had no voice. As for Marie, her life gradually returned to a new kind of normal. She resumed her job at the hospital, but this time with a greater sense of purpose. She had become a beacon of strength to her patients and colleagues, a reminder of the importance of integrity and resilience. In quiet moments, she would look around at the faces of those she cared for, feeling an overwhelming gratitude for her freedom, her family, and the community that had stood by her side. Marie's story lived on as a lesson in empathy and caution, a reminder to look beyond appearances and question assumptions. The people who had once judged her now saw her as a hero, someone who had faced the unthinkable and emerged stronger. Her case prompted discussions in town halls and community meetings, inspiring others to scrutinize the justice system and demand accountability from those in power. In the end, Marie's story was about more than her own exoneration. It was about the strength of truth, the courage to fight against all odds, and the transformative power of justice done right. Her journey from accused to absolved became a testament to resilience, forever etched in the memories of those who had witnessed her battle and celebrated her victory.